If a medieval groom discovered his bride wasn't a virgin on their wedding night, he could legally call all the wedding guests into the bedroom and rip open his wife's dress to expose her naked body. She'd be forced to publicly confess she'd been with another man. This wasn't cruelty, this wasn't revenge. This was the law, called the law of the false virgin. This practice reveals something terrifying about medieval marriage. A woman's body wasn't hers. It was property. And tonight you'll learn exactly how that worked. Welcome to Hearts and History. I'm your host, and tonight we're diving deep into one of history's most invasive traditions. Get comfortable, dim the lights, settle in. If you're new here, hit subscribe. I'd love to know where you're listening from tonight and what time it is where you are. Drop a comment below. Are you in bed in Chicago at midnight? Walking the dog in London at dawn? I read every single one. Tonight's story takes place in medieval Europe, and it's going to shock you. The law of the false virgin. Picture this. It's 1347. Somewhere in France. Marie is 16, just married to a man her father chose. She's terrified, not just because she's never been with a man before, but because she has. Once. With the baker's son last spring. Now she's lying in bed, knowing that if her new husband doesn't see blood on these sheets, he can legally destroy her life, strip her naked in front of everyone, annul the marriage, send her back to her father in disgrace. The law of the false virgin. See, this wasn't about morality. Not really. Medieval marriage was a business transaction. The bride's family paid a dowry, property, money, livestock. The groom's family got a wife who could produce legitimate heirs. But here's the thing, if that wife had been with another man, how could you guarantee the first child was actually your bloodline? You couldn't. So virginity became insurance. Proof of future paternity. A woman's body was literally the contract. The law of the false virgin. And the verification process was brutal. Before the wedding, midwives would examine the bride, physically inspect her body for signs of previous sexual activity. They'd check for an intact hymen, though they had no real understanding of how it actually worked. Sometimes this happened right before the ceremony, sometimes months earlier. Imagine being a teenage girl, spread out on a table while strangers poked and prodded you like you were livestock, being appraised for sale. The law of the false virgin. But the real test came on the wedding night, and this is where it gets really disturbing. In many regions, the bloodied sheets had to be displayed publicly the next morning, hung from windows, carried through the streets. Sometimes the bride's mother would inspect them first, then announced to the community that her daughter had been pure. The absence of blood wasn't just embarrassing, it was legally grounds for annulment. The marriage could be declared invalid, the dowry returned. The law of the false virgin. Now here's what's really twisted. Medieval people knew not all virgins bled. They weren't stupid. So they developed these elaborate tests to prove virginity scientifically. Fumigation tests where women were covered with cloth and exposed to burning coal. They believed virgins couldn't smell it through their nose, while non-virgins could. Doctors prescribed drinking certain substances that supposedly made non-virgins urinate immediately. This was considered legitimate medical practice, legitimate science, the law of the false virgin. And when women knew they'd fail these tests, they got creative. Medieval texts described recipes for faking virginity. Ground sugar mixed with egg whites and rainwater to tighten the vagina. Instructions for placing leeches carefully on the labia to draw blood and create what they called a little crust. Some women timed their weddings during menstruation. Others hid chicken blood in jewelry to stain the sheets. The lengths they went to, it shows how terrified they were. The law of the false virgin. The church blessed this whole system. Priests would literally bless the marriage bed as part of the ceremony. They taught that physical purity reflected spiritual purity, that a woman's virginity was a gift to God and her husband. But really, it was about property rights, inheritance laws, making sure family wealth stayed in the right bloodline. The religious language just made the whole thing sound holy instead of what it actually was: systematic control over women's bodies. The law of the false virgin. And this wasn't just peasant stuff. Royal brides faced even more scrutiny, more witnesses, more verification, because entire kingdoms hung on legitimate heirs. Catherine of Aragon reportedly kept her blood-stained honeymoon sheets for years after marrying Prince Arthur, presented them as evidence during Henry VIII's annulment proceedings decades later. Think about that. Sheets as legal evidence in a royal court. Your most intimate moment preserved as proof for political purposes. The law of the false virgin. What's insane is how recently this survived. Princess Diana was reportedly examined by the Queen's doctor in 1981 to verify her virginity before marrying Charles. 1981. Not the Middle Ages. Your parents were probably alive. Her uncle publicly declared her purity to the newspapers. The last royal to face such scrutiny. Coming up, we'll explore exactly how this system worked, the bizarre tests, the desperate solutions, and why it took so long to die. The commodity of purity. Here's what medieval marriage contracts actually were: property agreements, not romantic ceremonies, business deals, and the bride? She wasn't the customer. She was the merchandise. Her virginity wasn't about morality or purity in any spiritual sense. It was about money, land, titles, everything that mattered in medieval society. Because here's the thing, when you're transferring estates worth generations of wealth, you need absolute certainty about bloodlines. One illegitimate heir could destroy entire family dynasties. Virginity was insurance. Think of it this way. A medieval father isn't giving away his daughter, he's negotiating a merger. His daughter's body is the contract. Her virginity is the warranty. The groom's family is making a massive investment. Dowries, property agreements, political alliances. They need guarantees. And the only guarantee that the first child belongs to their bloodline? An untouched bride. This wasn't romantic. It was ruthlessly practical. Women were livestock with inheritance rights attached. Their value depreciated the moment someone else touched them first. The economics were brutal. A virgin bride meant the husband could be certain, absolutely certain, that any child born in the first 9 months was his biological heir. That child would inherit everything. Lands, titles, wealth accumulated over centuries. But if the bride wasn't a virgin, if there was even a chance she'd been with another man, that potential heir became a legal nightmare. Bastards had complicated inheritance rights. Some could claim legitimacy, others could challenge wills. Virginity eliminated all those messy legal battles. Medieval law recognized this explicitly. Marriage contracts included clauses about bride purity, detailed financial penalties if she turned out to be previously experienced. Some agreements allowed the groom to return her like defective merchandise, full refund. Others reduced the dowry payments, cut them in half or more, because a non-virgin bride couldn't guarantee legitimate heirs, and without that guarantee, her economic value plummeted. She became a risky investment, damaged goods in the most literal legal sense possible. The church played along because it served their interests too. Legitimate marriages meant stable property transfers. Stable property transfers meant consistent tithes and donations. Everyone benefited from this system, except the women trapped inside it. Their bodies became the foundation of medieval capitalism. Their hymens were worth more than their education, their intelligence, their personalities combined. A woman's entire social and economic value reduced to a thin membrane that might not even exist or might tear from riding horses. Here's how cold the calculations got. Legal texts from the period actually list different values for virgin versus non-virgin brides. Like pricing livestock, a virgin might be worth 200 marks, The same woman, if not a virgin, drops to 50, sometimes less. Courts treated rape cases the same way. Rape a virgin, massive fine. Rape a non-virgin, barely a slap on the wrist, because you damaged valuable property versus worthless property. The legal system literally priced women's worth based on sexual experience. Fathers understood this math perfectly. They guarded their daughters like gold reserves. Private tutors instead of public education. Locked bedrooms, constant supervision. Because every day their daughter remained untouched, her market value increased. Every day she stayed pure, more wealthy families would consider marriage proposals. But one mistake, one romantic encounter, and decades of careful investment evaporated overnight. She'd have to settle for a much poorer husband, or sometimes no husband at all, financial ruin through intimacy. The transfer ceremony made this obvious. Marriage wasn't between bride and groom. It was between father and future husband, two men shaking hands over property rights. The bride, she was handed over like a deed to a house. And just like buying property, the buyer wanted to inspect what they were getting. Virgin brides came with guarantees. Used brides came with problems. Medieval men paid premium prices for untouched women, because untouched women delivered clean inheritance lines. Simple economics. This created a bizarre secondary market. Families would hire investigators to research potential brides, background checks on sexual history, character references about purity. Some regions developed professional virgin certifiers, midwives who specialized in examining unmarried women and providing written guarantees of their status. These certificates became as valuable as money. Women carried them like modern credit scores. Your virginity rating determined your marriage prospects, which determined your entire future economic security. Medieval women lived under constant surveillance. The system protected male interests ruthlessly. Husbands could divorce wives if they discovered prior sexual experience. Keep the dowry, return the woman to her family in disgrace. But wives couldn't divorce husbands for anything comparable. Male promiscuity was irrelevant, expected even, because men didn't carry babies. Men couldn't pollute bloodlines with uncertain paternity. Only women posed that economic risk. So only women faced these invasive purity requirements. The double standard wasn't accidental. It was carefully engineered to protect male property rights. What's terrifying is how efficiently this system worked. For centuries, it turned half the population into walking commodities. Women internalized their own objectification, competed against each other for the highest virginity ratings, policed each other's behavior to protect the market value of purity itself. They became collaborators in their own economic enslavement. And the really twisted part, some women genuinely believed this system protected them, that their value as pure property was better than having no value at all. Stockholm Syndrome on a societal scale. The physical examinations. So who actually did the checking? Not doctors, not priests. Midwives. These were the women who delivered babies, who knew female bodies better than anyone else in medieval society. And they became the unofficial virginity police. Picture this, a nervous young woman, maybe 15 years old, being led into a small room by an older woman she's never met. No privacy, no choice, just orders to lie down and spread her legs so a stranger can poke around and decide her future. The examination itself was brutal in its simplicity. The midwife would insert her fingers into the girl's vagina, feeling for what they believed was an intact hymen. They called it the seal of purity. They thought it was like a solid barrier, something that would definitely tear during first intercourse. Completely wrong, by the way, but medieval medicine didn't know that. So these women based life-changing decisions on anatomy they didn't understand. The irony? The experts were completely clueless. Here's what made it even worse. These examinations happened twice. Once before the engagement was finalized, to make sure the groom's family wasn't getting damaged goods. Then again after the wedding night, if there was any doubt. Imagine that psychological torture. You pass the first test, thinking you're safe. Then your new husband questions the bloody sheets, and suddenly you're back in that room, legs spread, while the same midwife who cleared you days earlier now decides your marriage is valid or void. The records describe it exactly like livestock inspection. Seriously, the same language used for checking horses before purchase. Sound in body and pure. They'd examine the woman's posture, her gait, even her facial expressions for signs of corruption. Medieval people believed sexual experience changed a woman's entire demeanour, that she'd walk differently, look different. So the midwife wasn't just checking physical evidence. She was evaluating the whole person, like a farmer appraising cattle at market. These midwives held incredible power. One woman's word could destroy a family's reputation, cancel an engagement, or void a marriage. Some took bribes. Others were genuinely trying to help young women navigate an impossible system. But all of them were trapped in the same patriarchal structure. They were women policing other women's bodies for men's benefit. The most experienced healers in their communities, reduced to being glorified hymen inspectors. It was degrading for everyone involved. What were they actually looking for? They believed the hymen was like a wine cork, something that sealed the vagina completely, until it was broken by a man's entry. They expected to find either an intact barrier or obvious tears from previous penetration. They didn't know hymens come in different shapes. That many are naturally open. That horseback riding, manual labour, or even normal physical development could stretch them. They were looking for something that doesn't exist the way they imagined. The medical texts of the time are hilarious and horrifying. Doctors wrote about virginity like they were discussing a broken window. The seal, once broken, cannot be restored. They genuinely believed they could tell a woman's entire sexual history by poking around for a few minutes. Some thought virgins had a different smell. Others claimed virgin blood had special properties. Complete nonsense. But these were the leading medical minds of their era. Confident, detailed, and totally wrong about basic female anatomy. The humiliation was the point. This wasn't just medical examination. It was psychological control, a reminder that women's bodies belonged to other people, that your most private parts could be inspected by strangers whenever men decided they needed verification. Young brides learnt their first lesson about marriage before the wedding even happened. Your body isn't yours anymore. Your privacy doesn't matter. Your word isn't enough. Only a midwife's fingers can confirm your value as a wife. Some women faced multiple examinations by different midwives. If the first one gave an unclear result, they'd bring in a second opinion. Sometimes 3 or 4 women would examine the same bride, comparing notes like they were diagnosing a mysterious illness. Court records show cases where the examining midwives disagreed, leading to legal battles over whether the marriage was valid. Imagine your entire future hanging on whether a group of strangers could reach consensus about your body parts. The pressure on midwives was intense too. Get it wrong, and you'd face angry families, lawsuits, maybe even charges of fraud. Some specialized in pre-marriage examinations, building reputations for accuracy. Others refused to do them at all, calling the practice unethical. But in most communities, if you wanted to work as a midwife, virginity testing was part of the job. Like it or not, you were enforcing a system that reduced women to their hymens. But here's the thing about medieval people. They weren't stupid. Deep down, they knew these tests weren't foolproof. That's why the wedding night ritual was so important. The physical examination was just the first hurdle. The real test came on the wedding night itself, with bloody sheets and witnesses and public proof. Because even after all that poking and prodding by midwives, everyone knew the only evidence that really mattered was what happened in the marriage bed. The wedding night test. Picture this. You're a medieval bride. The feast is over. The dancing has stopped. And now comes the part that's been giving you nightmares for weeks. Your wedding night isn't private. It's not romantic. It's a test, a public examination, and if you fail, your entire life could be destroyed by mourning. Tonight, we're talking about one of the most terrifying traditions in medieval marriage, the wedding night blood test, where your worth as a woman literally depended on staining the sheets. The ceremony part is done. You're legally married. But the real test hasn't started yet, because in medieval Europe, the wedding wasn't complete until consummation was verified. And I mean verified. We're talking witnesses, inspections, and public proof. The bride's terror begins when the guests start moving toward the bedroom. This isn't a gentle transition to privacy. This is an escort to what feels like an execution. The groom's family, the bride's family, friends, they're all part of this procession, all heading to the marriage bed. First stop, the priest. Because even this invasive ritual needed divine blessing. The marriage bed itself would be consecrated, holy water sprinkled on the sheets, prayers said over the mattress. The priest would bless not just the union, but the specific act that was about to happen. Think about that for a second. A religious ceremony around a sexual encounter that would be evaluated by multiple people. The bride standing there while her bed gets turned into a sacred testing ground, her most intimate moment becoming a religious spectacle. Then comes the waiting. The couple gets escorted into the bedroom. The curtains get drawn around the bed. And everyone else? They don't leave. They wait outside those curtains, talking quietly, drinking wine, some probably making bets about what's happening behind that thin fabric. The bride knows this. She can hear them out there, hear their voices, their laughter, their whispered conversations, while she's supposed to be having the most intimate moment of her life, with an audience literally inches away. Can you imagine the pressure? Let's talk about what's going through this bride's head. She's maybe 14, 15 years old, knows nothing about intimacy except what her mother whispered to her that morning. And she knows that if she doesn't bleed tonight, she's ruined. Not just embarrassed, ruined. Her marriage could be annulled. Her family could lose their alliance. She could be sent away in disgrace. So she's lying there terrified, not of the physical act itself, but of failing a test she doesn't understand. A test that will determine her entire future. Morning comes, the moment of truth. The guests crowd back into the bedroom, and the sheet inspection begins. They're looking for blood. Any blood. The right kind of blood in the right place. The bride's standing there, probably still in her nightgown, while multiple people examine her bedding like detectives at a crime scene. Her mother-in-law checking the sheets. Her new husband's friends nodding approval or frowning with concern. This isn't private. This isn't gentle. This is a public evaluation of her most intimate moment. And everyone has an opinion. But what if there's no blood? What if the sheets are clean? Then the real nightmare begins. Because a bloodless mourning didn't just mean disappointment. It meant accusations. The bride wasn't a virgin. She'd deceived the family, lied about her purity. The groom could demand an annulment. The bride's family might have to return the dowry. In some places, she could be publicly humiliated, stripped naked in front of the same people who'd celebrated her wedding the night before. Her failure becomes everyone's business. Her shame becomes entertainment. And here's what makes it worse. The blood wasn't just examined privately. Oh no, in many medieval communities, those bloody sheets got displayed, hung from windows, paraded through streets, shown to neighbours. The evidence of the bride's purity became a public announcement. Her blood became proof that the marriage was legitimate, the family's honour intact, and the inheritance secure. Think about that. Your most private, vulnerable moment turned into a neighbourhood bulletin board. Your blood becoming everyone's relief. Your pain becoming everyone's celebration. The psychological damage was massive. Imagine being a teenage girl, traumatized by public humiliation, and then having to live with the man who allowed it. having to face the same people who witnessed your shame, having to rebuild your life after being stripped of dignity in front of everyone you knew. Some brides never recovered. The wedding night test didn't just verify virginity, it destroyed young women's sense of self, their trust in intimacy, their belief in privacy. The trauma lasted decades. The shame never really ended. Medieval marriage began with public violation. So why was this considered normal? Why did entire communities participate in this ritual? Because medieval marriage wasn't about love. It was about property transfer. The bride's virginity guaranteed that any children were biologically the husband's. The bloodied sheets were proof of a clean transaction, like a receipt for livestock, like a warranty on a purchase. The bride's body was the product being verified. Her blood was the proof of authenticity. Her trauma was just the cost of doing business. The price of a legitimate marriage in a world where women were property. The wedding night test reveals something chilling about medieval life. Privacy didn't exist for women. Intimacy wasn't sacred. Your body wasn't your own. The most vulnerable moment of your life became a public performance, evaluated by people who saw you as an investment rather than a person. And this wasn't an isolated practice. This happened across Europe for centuries to countless young women who had no choice but to submit to public humiliation disguised as tradition. The wedding night wasn't about love, it was about proving ownership when brides failed. Picture this nightmare scenario. The midwife's examination revealed no intact hymen, or the wedding night sheets showed no blood. What happened next wasn't just embarrassment, it was legal catastrophe. Medieval law treated these failures as fraud. The bride had essentially sold damaged goods. Her husband could demand a full refund of the dowry. He could annul the marriage on the spot. And in some regions, he could literally strip her naked before the assembled wedding guests. This wasn't cruelty for its own sake. This was justice. Medieval justice. The legal ramifications were immediate and devastating. Under the law of the false virgin, a non-virgin bride had committed fraud. Her family had to return the entire dowry, plus interest, sometimes plus damages. The groom could walk away from all marriage contracts. Property agreements? Void. Business partnerships between families? Cancelled. Land transfers? Reversed. One failed virginity test could bankrupt a family overnight. And here's the twisted part. The bride's father often faced heavier penalties than his daughter. He'd vouched for damaged merchandise. But the financial devastation was nothing compared to the public humiliation. In some Germanic regions, the failed bride was dragged before the entire wedding party. Her dress was ripped open, her body exposed to prove the deception. Guests would examine her themselves, because apparently everyone was suddenly a virginity expert. She had to confess her previous sexual experience, name her former lover if she could, beg forgiveness from her new husband while standing there naked. Think about that level of violation, in front of her own family. The social consequences followed her forever. Medieval society branded these women with a scarlet letter before scarlet letters existed. They were known as false virgins or damaged goods. Other families wouldn't arrange marriages with her siblings. Her own children, if she had any, faced whispered accusations about their legitimacy. The family name carried the stain for generations. And here's what's particularly brutal. Even if she'd been assaulted, even if the loss of virginity wasn't her choice, she still faced these consequences. Assault victims were punished for being assaulted. Some regions had specific legal punishments written into their codes. In parts of France, a false virgin could be publicly whipped through the town square. Her hair was shaved off to mark her shame. In Germanic territories, she might be dunked repeatedly in the river, a practice borrowed from witch trials. The logic was twisted but consistent. She'd contaminated the sacred marriage bed, so she needed cleansing. Physical pain was considered appropriate punishment for sexual deception. These weren't random acts of violence. They were legal sentences carried out by authorities. The church added its own layer of punishment. Non-virgin brides were often banned from taking communion for months or years. They couldn't serve as godmothers. They were excluded from certain religious festivals. Some priests refused to give them last rites when they died. The spiritual consequences were designed to match the social ones. They'd violated God's plan for marriage by deceiving their husband. Their souls were considered as damaged as their hymens. Redemption was possible, but it required years of public penance. For noble families, the stakes were even higher. A failed virginity test could topple political alliances. Entire kingdoms had arranged marriages to secure peace treaties. If the bride turned out to be non-virgin, those treaties could collapse. Wars could restart. The French court recorded at least 3 major diplomatic crises in the 14th century caused by failed virginity tests. Armies had mobilized over bloodstained sheets, or the lack thereof. When royal marriages failed these tests, it wasn't just personal humiliation, it was international incident. The psychological trauma was immeasurable. Young women lived in terror of their wedding nights. They'd spend months before marriage checking themselves obsessively, praying their hymens would bleed, attempting the bizarre remedies we discussed earlier. Some developed what we'd now recognize as severe anxiety disorders. Others became suicidal. Medieval records show an unusual number of young brides dying mysteriously just before or after their weddings. Coincidence? Probably not. The pressure literally killed some of these women. Fear of failure became a death sentence in itself. The accused bride had virtually no legal recourse. She couldn't argue that hymens break naturally. Medieval courts didn't accept that defense. She couldn't claim assault had taken her virginity, that still made her damaged goods. She couldn't point out that many virgins don't bleed. Medieval law didn't recognize that medical reality. Her only options were complete confession and humiliation, or attempting to prove her accusers wrong. But how do you prove a negative? How do you prove you were virgin when the evidence says otherwise? You couldn't. Some families tried desperate damage control. They'd claim their daughter had been secretly examined by a different midwife who confirmed her virginity. They'd produce witnesses who swore they'd seen her hymen intact. They'd argue the wedding night examination was flawed or biased. Occasionally these defenses worked, if the family had enough money to bribe the right people. But usually, the bride's failure condemned the entire family to social exile. Medieval society was unforgiving about sexual deception, even suspected sexual deception. The most chilling aspect: this system was designed to work exactly as it did. The harsh consequences weren't bugs in medieval marriage law, they were features. The brutal punishment for failed virginity tests served as a deterrent. It kept families honest about their daughter's sexual history. It maintained the male property rights that underpinned medieval marriage. The system wasn't broken. It was working perfectly if you valued property rights over human dignity. And medieval society absolutely did. The women who suffered these consequences weren't unfortunate victims. They were necessary sacrifices. The fumigation tests. Picture this scene: a young bride, hours before her wedding, stripped and covered with a heavy cloth. Beneath her, burning coals release thick, acrid smoke. A doctor watches her face intently, waiting for her reaction. This wasn't torture, this was medieval science. Physicians genuinely believed they could detect virginity through smell. The theory: virgins and non-virgins would react differently to specific fumes. It sounds insane today, but for centuries this was considered legitimate medical practice. The logic behind fumigation tests came from medieval understanding of female anatomy. Doctors believed a woman's reproductive system was connected through internal passages. If smoke entered through her nose or mouth, it would travel through her body differently depending on whether she'd had sexual intercourse. Virgins supposedly couldn't smell the burning coal through their noses. Non-virgins could detect it immediately. This wasn't folklore. Medical texts prescribed these procedures. Doctors charged fees for conducting them. The actual procedure was elaborate and humiliating. The woman would be undressed and seated over a brazier of burning coals. Sometimes aromatic herbs were added to the fire, frankincense, myrrh, or other strong-smelling substances. A heavy cloth or blanket completely covered her from head to toe, trapping the smoke around her body. The physician would observe her breathing, facial expressions, and any signs of distress. The test could last several minutes while the woman inhaled concentrated fumes. Who performed these tests? Usually physicians or learned monks with medical training. Sometimes midwives assisted, but the fumigation test required someone with supposed scientific knowledge. These weren't back-alley procedures. Wealthy families paid good money for certified doctors to conduct virginity verification. The tests often happened in churches or medical facilities. Witnesses were present to verify the results. Everything was documented. This was considered as legitimate as any other medical examination of the era. According to medieval medical theory, virgin and non-virgin women would react completely differently to the same smoke. Virgins supposedly remained calm, breathing normally, showing no signs of detecting the smell. Non-virgins would immediately become agitated, cough, or show obvious discomfort from the odour. Some texts claimed non-virgins would try to escape the smoke or breathe through their mouths instead of their noses. The doctor's job was interpreting these supposed behavioural differences as definitive proof of sexual history. This made perfect sense to medieval physicians because they fundamentally misunderstood human anatomy. They believed women's bodies contained internal air passages connecting the reproductive organs to the nose and mouth. Sexual intercourse supposedly altered these passages permanently. Therefore, smoke would travel differently through a non-virgin's body, making smells more detectable. Modern medicine knows this is complete nonsense, but medieval doctors had no understanding of actual respiratory or reproductive systems. Their confidence was absolute. How common were fumigation tests? More widespread than you'd think. Medical manuscripts from across Europe reference the procedure. The practice appeared in Italy, France, England, and German territories. Some regions preferred fumigation over physical examination by midwives. Certain noble families specifically requested fumigation because it seemed more scientific, more objective than manual inspection. If a prestigious doctor certified the results, the bride's family gained extra credibility. Social status influenced which verification method families chose. Imagine the psychological terror for young women facing this test. You're about to marry, probably nervous already, and now you must sit naked over burning coals while a strange man watches your every reaction. Any natural response to smoke, coughing, watering eyes, trying to breathe fresh air, could be interpreted as proof you'd already lost your virginity. The pressure to remain perfectly still and calm must have been overwhelming. Some women probably failed simply from anxiety. Different regions developed variations of the fumigation test. Some doctors used burning herbs instead of plain coals. Others tested with incense, believing certain scents were more revealing than others. A few texts mention heating specific oils or resins. The cockle flower fumigation involved burning particular plants while observing whether the woman's complexion changed colour. Each variation claimed to be more accurate than previous methods. None of them worked, obviously, but medieval medicine loved elaborate procedures. The complete lack of actual science behind fumigation tests is staggering. No biological mechanism exists for sexual history to affect smell detection through smoke inhalation. The human respiratory system doesn't connect to reproductive organs the way medieval doctors believed. Women's reactions to burning coals would depend entirely on individual tolerance to smoke, not sexual experience. Yet for generations, learned physicians staked their reputations on these procedures. Confidence and authority substituted for actual knowledge. Fumigation was just one tool in medieval medicine's bizarre virginity detection arsenal. When smoke tests proved inconclusive, doctors turned to other equally ridiculous methods. They examined urine colour and consistency. They tested whether certain drinks would cause immediate urination in non-virgins. They looked for specific changes in complexion when women smelled particular flowers. Each new test claimed greater accuracy than the last. All of them shared one thing: complete scientific worthlessness, masked by elaborate medical authority. The urine and pallor tests. Here's where medieval medicine gets truly bizarre. Doctors didn't just rely on fumigation tests. They developed an entire arsenal of what they considered scientific virginity detection methods. Picture this: learnt physicians, men who studied for years, genuinely believed they could diagnose a woman's intimate history through flower colours and bathroom habits. We're talking about practices that were written down, taught in medical schools, and prescribed with complete confidence. The level of pseudoscience here is staggering. One popular test involved making women drink specific concoctions. The theory? Non-virgins would immediately need to urinate after consuming these mysterious substances, while virgins wouldn't react at all. Medieval doctors actually prescribed these drinks with absolute certainty in their effectiveness. Think about that for a second. They believed a woman's bladder function could reveal her sexual history. The recipes varied by region, but the confidence remained universal across medieval Europe. Then there's the pallor test. This one's particularly wild. Doctors would have women hold or smell dock flowers, those common weeds you see everywhere. According to medieval medical texts, if a woman was truly a virgin, she would immediately turn pale upon contact with these flowers. Non-virgins? No colour change at all. Physicians genuinely believed dock flowers were like medieval pregnancy tests, but for virginity, the fact that this was considered legitimate medical practice is mind-bending. What's incredible is how these tests were documented. Medieval medical manuscripts describe the procedures in precise detail, complete with expected results and timing. They weren't treating this as folklore or superstition. This was medicine. University-trained physicians included these methods in their official diagnostic repertoire. The same doctors performing surgery and setting bones were also confidently administering flower-sniffing virginity tests. The cognitive dissonance is absolutely fascinating from a historical perspective. The urination tests came in multiple varieties. Some involved herbal teas, others required drinking wine mixed with specific powders. Medieval texts describe watching women carefully after consumption, noting any signs of bladder urgency. Doctors would time the response, measure the amount, even analyze the color. They developed elaborate charts correlating bathroom behavior with sexual history. It's like they created an entire pseudoscientific methodology around something that makes absolutely no biological sense whatsoever. The pallor test had regional variations too. Some areas used different flowers, roses, lilies, even certain grasses. The underlying belief remained consistent though. Something about a virgin's pure essence would cause a visible physical reaction to these plants. Medical texts described the exact shade of paleness to look for, how quickly it should appear, how long it should last. They created detailed diagnostic criteria for what was essentially medieval magical thinking dressed up as science. What's particularly disturbing is how confident these doctors were. Medieval medical writing doesn't express doubt about these methods. There's no hedge words, no maybe this works. The texts present these tests as established fact. Physicians staked their reputations on being able to determine virginity through flowers and drinks. They taught these methods to apprentices, passed them down through generations of medical practitioners. Entire medical careers were built around anatomical misunderstandings. Some tests combined multiple elements. A woman might be required to drink a special concoction, then immediately smell dock flowers while physicians monitored both her bladder response and colour changes. They believed layering these tests increased accuracy. Medieval medicine was creating complex diagnostic protocols for something that couldn't actually be diagnosed this way. The systematic nature of this pseudoscience is what makes it so historically significant and genuinely disturbing. The social pressure around these tests was immense. Families would seek out physicians known for their expertise in virginity verification. Doctors built reputations around their success rates with these bizarre methods. Some became famous throughout regions for their supposed skill with flower tests and drink diagnoses. Medical practices specialized in this area. We're talking about an entire cottage industry of pseudoscientific virginity testing that lasted for centuries across medieval Europe. The economic incentives driving these practices can't be ignored. Physicians charged substantial fees for virginity testing services. Wealthy families paid premium prices for multiple test confirmations. The more elaborate the procedure, the higher the cost. Some doctors developed signature methods, secret recipes, proprietary flower combinations. They were essentially selling false certainty to anxious families, wrapping profit-driven quackery in the authority of medical degrees and scholarly Latin terminology. Perhaps most tragic is how these tests affected the women subjected to them. Imagine being examined by strange men who claimed flowers could reveal your intimate secrets. The psychological trauma of having your worth determined by whether dockweeds made you pale or drinks made you urinate. These weren't just medical procedures, they were rituals of humiliation disguised as science. Medieval women endured this because society convinced them these bizarre tests were legitimate, necessary, and morally justified. Medieval DIY solutions. Picture this. You're a medieval woman, maybe 17, maybe 20. Your wedding's in 3 days, and you absolutely know, that when your new husband pulls back those sheets, there won't be blood. The midwife examination is coming. The witnesses will be waiting outside your bedroom door. Your father's reputation, your family's honour, your own survival, it all depends on evidence your body can't provide anymore. So what do? You get creative, you get desperate, and you follow recipes that would make your skin crawl. These weren't isolated cases. Across medieval Europe, women were trading secrets, whispering instructions, sharing techniques to manufacture what nature wouldn't provide. They had entire networks, older women teaching younger ones, sisters helping sisters, because failing that virginity test wasn't just embarrassing, it could destroy your life. Legally, your husband could reject you, send you back to your father in shame, or worse, strip you naked in front of the wedding guests and force you to confess your crimes against his property rights. The most detailed instructions come from something called the Trotula. This was a collection of medical texts supposedly written by women doctors in medieval Italy, and buried inside these legitimate medical guides, step-by-step recipes for deception, instructions titled "For the Woman Who Does Not Have Her Virginity," not hidden, not coded, just matter-of-fact medical advice for desperate brides. Because apparently even medieval doctors understood that virginity testing was creating a market for alternative solutions. The recipes are shockingly specific. Here's what the Trotula actually recommended. Take ground sugar, egg whites, alum, and rainwater. Mix them into a thick paste. The alum was the key ingredient. It's a mineral that causes tissue to contract and tighten. Painful, but effective for what they needed. The sugar provided consistency. The egg whites created a binding agent. And the rainwater, that was considered the purest form of water available. They weren't just throwing ingredients together randomly. This was carefully researched, medieval chemistry, designed to fool husbands and midwives alike. The process was brutal. Women were instructed to soak cloth strips in this mixture and insert them hours before the wedding night. The alum would cause the vaginal tissue to contract painfully, creating artificial tightness. Then they'd bathe their genitals in the same solution repeatedly. The goal was to create the physical sensation a virgin husband would expect. But here's the thing about alum. It's essentially a chemical burn. These women were deliberately injuring themselves to maintain the illusion. The pain must have been excruciating, and that was just the beginning. Some recipes included ground glass mixed with sheep's blood, creating a paste that would cause bleeding when inserted. Others used needles dipped in chicken blood, hidden inside the vagina to puncture tissue at the right moment. Think about the courage or desperation required to insert ground glass into your own body, to create wounds that would convince your husband you were bleeding from lost virginity instead of self-inflicted injuries. The lengths these women went to speaks to absolute terror of discovery. The psychological toll was devastating. These women spent weeks before their weddings practicing deception, enduring pain, and living in constant fear of getting caught. They had to time everything perfectly, apply the solutions close enough to the wedding night for effectiveness, but not so close that they couldn't hide their obvious discomfort. They had to act surprised by the pain during consummation, pretend the blood was unexpected. Imagine performing that level of theatre while your body is literally burning from chemical treatments you inflicted on yourself. Some women tried less invasive methods. They'd time their weddings during their menstrual cycle, hoping to pass off period blood as proof of virginity. Others hid vials of animal blood in their jewellery, breaking them against the sheets at the crucial moment. A few desperate brides even arranged for other women, actual virgins, to substitute for them in the darkness of the wedding chamber. The bride would enter, the substitute would consummate, then they'd switch back before morning. The logistics alone must have been nightmarish. The secrecy was absolute. Getting caught meant worse punishment than just failing the original test. Now, you weren't just a non-virgin, you were a liar and a fraud. The penalties could include public humiliation, financial ruin, or even accusations of witchcraft. So these women created codes, met in secret, and destroyed evidence of their preparations. They lived double lives for weeks, appearing calm and bridal, while secretly conducting chemistry experiments on their own bodies. The stress alone could have killed them. Most of these methods didn't actually work. Medieval husbands and midwives weren't idiots. They knew about the Trotula recipes. They could recognize chemical burns, artificial bleeding, and suspicious timing. But the women kept trying anyway because the alternative, telling the truth, meant certain destruction. So they chose possible discovery over guaranteed ruin. They chose agonizing hope over inevitable shame. And sometimes, just sometimes, they fooled everyone. Those success stories kept the desperate techniques alive for centuries. These DIY solutions reveal something heartbreaking about medieval marriage. Women were so terrified of their wedding nights that they willingly tortured themselves for weeks beforehand. They turned what should have been preparation for intimacy into preparation for deception. They couldn't trust their husbands with truth, couldn't rely on love to overcome disappointment. Instead, they chose pain, secrecy, and chemical burns over honesty. But some women went even further. Some chose methods that make the Trotula recipes look gentle by comparison. Leeches and chicken blood. Picture a medieval bride 3 days before her wedding. She knows she's not a virgin. She knows what happens to women who fail the test. So she makes a choice that would horrify us today. She places live leeches on her most intimate parts. Why? To create artificial bleeding, to fake evidence of virginity. This wasn't desperation, this was strategy. Medieval women developed an entire underground network of techniques to fool their husbands, their families, and the law. What you're about to hear gets disturbing fast. The Trotula, a medieval medical text, actually provided detailed instructions for non-virgin brides. But when those recipes failed, when the ground sugar and alum mixtures weren't enough, women turned to blood. Real blood. They'd carefully place leeches on their labia days before the wedding. The goal? Create small wounds that would scab over. When those scabs broke during consummation, they'd bleed fresh. Painful? Absolutely. Dangerous? Completely. But it worked. Medieval medical knowledge couldn't tell the difference between leech wounds and a torn hymen. But leeches were just one method. Smart brides timed their weddings during their menstrual cycles. Think about that calculation. planning your entire wedding around your period, because if you were bleeding naturally, no one could question whether the blood on the sheets was legitimate. The timing had to be perfect. Too early in the cycle, and the bleeding would stop. Too late, and there'd be no blood at all. Medieval women became experts at tracking their own bodies for deception. Then there was the chicken blood trick. Women would hide small vials of fresh chicken blood in their jewellery, rings with secret compartments, bracelets designed to break under pressure. The blood had to be fresh, no more than a day old, or it would clot and darken. On the wedding night, they'd discreetly break open the vial and smear the blood where it needed to be. Their husbands never suspected. The sheets told the story everyone expected to see. Virginity verified through poultry. Some women went even further. They'd substitute an actual virgin into the marriage bed. In the darkness of a medieval bedchamber, with candles extinguished for modesty, a bride could send her younger sister or a servant girl in her place. The virgin would consummate the marriage, provide the necessary blood evidence, then slip away before dawn. The real bride would return to her husband's bed, her secret safe. It sounds impossible, but it worked more often than you'd think. The risks were enormous. Leeches could cause serious infection. Medieval hygiene meant any wound could turn septic. Women died from these attempts. But the alternative, public humiliation, annulment, sometimes violence, made the risk worth taking. Some brides mixed chicken blood with wine to create a more convincing texture. Others used pig's blood because it stayed liquid longer. The medieval equivalent of special effects makeup, except the consequences of getting caught were life-destroying. Fish bladders filled with blood became popular among wealthy brides. They were easier to conceal than glass vials and burst more naturally under pressure. The blood would be mixed with egg whites to create the right consistency. Some women practiced bursting the bladders beforehand, timing how long it took, where to position them, how much pressure was needed. It's grotesque, but these women were essentially engineers of deception, medieval special effects artists working to save their own lives. The psychological toll was devastating. Imagine lying in bed next to your new husband, knowing your entire marriage was built on an elaborate lie, knowing that discovery meant not just divorce, but public disgrace. Some women carried the secret their entire lives. Others confessed years later, after bearing children, when their husbands might be more forgiving. But many took the truth to their graves. Medieval marriage began with performance, deception, and the constant fear of being found out. What's truly shocking is how organized this was. Older women, midwives, even some mothers taught these techniques. There were networks of knowledge passed down through generations. The methods were refined, perfected, shared in whispers. Medieval women created an entire shadow industry around faking virginity. They had suppliers for fresh blood, craftsmen who made specialized jewelry, and accomplices who could step in as substitutes. It was systematic resistance against systematic oppression. The irony? Many husbands probably knew. Fresh blood looks different from menstrual blood. Leech wounds heal in distinctive patterns. But challenging your bride meant admitting you couldn't tell the difference, which reflected poorly on your masculine knowledge. So husbands accepted the evidence, wives provided the performance, and everyone maintained the fiction. Medieval marriage was theatre, with both parties playing their assigned roles. The alternative was too socially catastrophic for either side. These desperate measures reveal something profound about medieval women. Faced with impossible standards and brutal consequences, they didn't just submit, they fought back with intelligence, creativity, and incredible courage. They risked infection, death, and discovery to control their own narratives. Yes, the methods were horrifying, but they were also acts of rebellion against a system designed to reduce women to property. Medieval brides were far more resourceful and defiant than history typically admits, and infinitely braver than we often realize. The Church's role. Here's something that'll mess with your head. The same priests who preached about love and compassion. They were blessing marriage beds like they were altars. Picture this, a medieval wedding night, but before the couple even touches, there's a priest standing over their bed with holy water, sprinkling it on the sheets, muttering prayers over the mattress. Because in their minds, what was about to happen wasn't just physical, it was a sacred test. Spiritual purity meeting physical proof, God Himself watching. The Church didn't just tolerate virginity testing, they made it holy. They created this whole theology where a bride's intact hymen was literally a sacrament, like communion bread or baptismal water. Her body became a sacred vessel that proved God's blessing on the marriage. Think about that logic for a second. They took the most intimate moment between two people and turned it into a religious ceremony, with witnesses, with prayers, with the weight of heaven and hell hanging over blood-stained sheets. The blessing ceremony was elaborate. The priest would arrive before sunset, carrying his holy water and prayer book. He'd sprinkle the bed, the pillows, even the curtains. Then came the Latin prayers, something about purity and fruitfulness and divine protection. The whole time, the bride standing there, knowing her worth as a Christian woman depends on what happens next. Her salvation tied to her anatomy, her soul measured by her body. Medieval Christianity at its most invasive. Here's what gets me about this whole thing. The Church taught that sex was sinful, right? Except on your wedding night, when it magically becomes sacred duty. But only if you're a virgin, only if you bleed, only if you prove your purity to God and witnesses. They created this impossible standard where women had to be both pure and sexual, both innocent and fertile, all while priests stood outside their bedroom doors, waiting for proof of divine approval. The religious texts from this period are wild. Treatises explaining how a virgin bride's blood was like Christ's sacrifice, how her pain during first intercourse mirrored religious suffering. They literally compared defloration to crucifixion, made it a holy act of redemption. Medieval theologians spent serious time debating whether non-virgin brides could receive communion, whether their marriages were blessed by God, whether their children would be legitimate in heaven's eyes. Academic papers about hymens and salvation. The Church created confession protocols specifically for this. If a bride didn't bleed, she had to confess her previous sins to the priest, name her former lovers, describe her sexual history in detail, then perform penance, sometimes years of it. They had special prayers for fallen women, and different ones for deceived husbands, an entire bureaucracy built around women's bodies, religious paperwork for private parts, sacred shame management. It was systematic spiritual abuse disguised as moral guidance. Different denominations had different approaches. Catholic priests blessed the bed and waited for proof. Orthodox churches had elaborate purification rituals if the bride failed the test. Protestant reformers, they kept the virginity requirements, but ditched some ceremony, because apparently what mattered wasn't the blessing, it was the bleeding. The ritual could change, but the control over women's bodies? That was non-negotiable across all Christian traditions. Universal sexism with denominational flavouring. The priests had theological justification for everything. They cited Mary's virginity as the ultimate example, referenced Old Testament laws about blood and purity, created this whole doctrine where women's bodies were either temples of God or corrupted vessels. No middle ground. You were either pure enough for divine blessing or tainted beyond redemption. They turned anatomy into theology, made hymens into holy relics, weaponized scripture against women's autonomy, and called it God's will. Some regions had blessed cloths, special linens consecrated by the bishop, specifically for wedding nights. These weren't just sheets, they were religious artifacts. The bloodstains weren't just proof of virginity, they were evidence of divine favour. Families would keep these cloths for generations, pass them down like heirlooms, display them during church festivals, your great-grandmother's high meal blood as family treasure. Sacred menstruation memorabilia. The church turned private moments into public religious theatre. The most twisted part. The church taught that failed brides could still achieve salvation through suffering. Extra prayers, extended penance, spiritual humiliation as redemption. They created this whole secondary theology for impure women. Special convents for former brides who failed the test. Different communion wafers. Separate seating in church. They built an entire religious caste system based on vaginal examination results. Eternal soul status determined by a piece of skin that might not even exist. By the Renaissance, some church scholars started questioning this system. Not because it was wrong, but because it was unreliable. They kept detailed records of false positives and negatives, statistical analysis of hymen accuracy rates, academic debates about anatomical theology. But instead of abandoning the practice, they doubled down, created more elaborate tests, more complex rituals, more invasive examinations. When your religious doctrine depends on controlling women's bodies, you don't question the doctrine, you perfect the control. Royal stakes. If you thought virginity testing was brutal for common brides, wait until you hear what royal women faced. The stakes weren't just personal humiliation. We're talking about international treaties, military alliances, inheritance of entire kingdoms. A princess's hymen could literally determine whether two nations went to war. Think about that pressure for a second. Your wedding night isn't just between you and your husband, it's between your body and the political survival of empires. The higher you climbed the social ladder, the more eyes were watching your bedsheets. Royal marriages weren't love matches. They were business transactions written in treaties and sealed with virgin blood. When Princess A married Prince B, her father was essentially saying, "Here's proof my daughter has never been compromised. Your bloodline will be pure." But if that proof didn't materialize, treaties could be voided, trade agreements cancelled, military support withdrawn. One drop of missing blood could topple governments. Royal virginity wasn't just about family honor, it was international diplomacy conducted through a teenage girl's body. The scrutiny noble brides faced was absolutely insane. Where a merchant's wife might be examined by one midwife, a duchess faced a panel of court physicians. Royal women, forget about it. Multiple doctors, ladies in waiting, foreign ambassadors, church officials, sometimes 20 people or more, had official business verifying a princess's purity. They document everything, write reports, file formal statements with royal seals. Your most intimate anatomy became a matter of state record, preserved in official archives that still exist today in some European libraries. Royal weddings turned virginity verification into theatre. The bigger the political stakes, the grander the spectacle. We're talking about bedchambers specifically designed for witnessed consummation, balconies for observers, ceremonial curtains that could be dramatically opened. Some courts had official bed blessing ceremonies where dozens of witnesses watched priests sanctify the royal mattress. The bride's blood-stained nightgown would sometimes be displayed from palace windows the next morning. Your wedding night evidence became a public proclamation of successful political alliance. Here's what's really wild about royal verification. They'd sometimes test princesses months before their wedding. Court physicians would conduct purity inspections as part of marriage negotiations. Imagine being 14 years old and foreign diplomats are literally examining your body to determine your political value. These examinations were documented, notarized, and sent to the groom's family as official certification. Your hymen became a diplomatic document, a treaty clause written in flesh. And if the inspection revealed anything suspicious, the entire marriage could be called off, creating international incidents. The psychological pressure on royal brides was absolutely crushing. Common women faced family shame if they failed verification. Royal women faced war. Their failure could mean their father's kingdom lost vital alliances. Their brothers couldn't inherit certain titles. Their people might face invasion without expected military support. Some young princesses were so terrified they'd resort to desperate measures: leeches, fake blood, even substituting servants in darkened bedchambers. The weight of entire civilizations rested on maintaining one small piece of anatomy that might not even bleed naturally. Royal bloodlines weren't just about family trees. They were about legal legitimacy that kept kingdoms stable. If a queen couldn't prove her virginity, any children she bore faced questions about their paternity. Illegitimate heirs meant succession crises, civil wars, foreign invasions, competing claims to the throne. So royal families developed elaborate verification protocols that went far beyond common practice. Multiple witnesses, signed testimonies, preserved physical evidence. Your body became the foundation document of governmental legitimacy. No pressure, right? Just the stability of civilization hanging on your wedding night performance. Royal verification ceremonies made common bedding rituals look private. We're talking about guest lists longer than modern wedding receptions, ambassadors from allied nations, church hierarchies, court officials, military commanders, foreign nobility. Everyone with political investment in the marriage had representation in or near the royal bedchamber. Some courts had tiered observation, inner witnesses who could see everything, outer witnesses who waited for reports. The bride's blood-stained linens would be ceremonially presented to these assembled dignitaries like evidence in a court case, because essentially that's exactly what it was. The difference between noble and common verification was like comparing a small-town trial to international court proceedings. A baker's daughter might face one midwife and some family members. A countess faced court physicians and written reports. But a princess? Full diplomatic protocol, international observers, formal documentation, sworn testimonies, religious ceremonies, sometimes even artistic documentation. Painters commissioned to create witness portraits showing who was present for the verification. Your most private moment became state pageantry with permanent historical record. Privacy was a luxury nobility couldn't afford. Royal families had backup plans for verification failures that reveal how high the stakes really were. Secret examinations before official ones. Physicians on retainer who specialized in restoration procedures. Court ladies trained in evidence fabrication. Emergency marriage postponements disguised as political delays. Even arrangements for substitute brides in extreme cases. The machinery surrounding royal virginity was an entire shadow industry designed to protect political stability. Because admitting your princess wasn't pure meant admitting your diplomatic word was worthless. Kings would rather fake evidence than face that international humiliation. Royal stakes in virginity verification created a system where teenage girls carried the weight of international politics on their bodies. Every examination, every witness, every drop of blood or lack thereof could reshape the map of Europe. These weren't just personal moments of intimacy. They were state functions as carefully orchestrated as coronations. The higher the social rank, the more public the privacy became. Which brings us to specific cases where royal blood-stained sheets literally changed history, including one set of linens that were preserved for decades as legal evidence in what would become England's most famous divorce. Catherine of Aragon's sheets. Picture this. You're in a Tudor courtroom, 1529. Divorce proceedings that will split England from Rome forever. And the star witness? A piece of blood-stained fabric from a wedding night 28 years earlier. Catherine of Aragon, first wife of Henry VIII, had saved her honeymoon sheets from her marriage to Prince Arthur for nearly 3 decades. Why? Because she knew someday she might need proof that she was a virgin when she married Arthur. That someday had arrived. Let's back up to 1501. Catherine's 15. Spanish princess. Political pawn in the marriage game between Spain and England. She's shipped off to marry Arthur, Prince of Wales, Henry VII's eldest son, the heir to the Tudor throne. Their marriage would cement the alliance between Spain and England. Everything's riding on this working out. The wedding happens at St. Paul's Cathedral, November 14th, 1501. Massive celebration. Then comes the bedding ceremony and those sheets that would haunt Catherine for decades. The wedding night happens exactly as medieval protocol demands. Witnesses escort the young couple to their chamber. The bed's been blessed by priests. Everyone's waiting outside those curtains for proof of consummation. And when morning comes, there's the blood. The evidence Catherine was a virgin bride. Standard procedure would be to display those sheets, maybe parade them around. But Catherine, she keeps them, carefully preserved, like she knows something the rest of the court doesn't yet realise. 5 months later, Arthur's dead. Probably tuberculosis, possibly the sweating sickness. Catherine's a widow at 16, stuck in England with a massive problem. Her dowry's already been paid. Her value to England was producing an heir with Arthur. Now what? King Henry VII has a solution. His younger son Henry. But there's a legal complication. Church law forbids marrying your brother's widow, unless Catherine never actually consummated her marriage to Arthur, unless she's still technically a virgin. Catherine swears she never slept with Arthur. Their marriage was never consummated. She's still a virgin, free to marry Henry. Pope Julius II issues a special dispensation in 1503, allowing the marriage. Henry VII dies in 1509. Young Henry VIII becomes king and marries Catherine 2 months later. For 20 years, everything seems fine. Catherine gives birth to Mary in 1516, but Henry wants a male heir, and by the late 1520s, he's desperately in love with Anne Boleyn. 1527. Henry decides his marriage to Catherine is cursed by God because he violated biblical law by marrying his brother's widow. He needs an annulment. His argument? Catherine's lying. She did sleep with Arthur. Her marriage to Arthur was consummated, making her subsequent marriage to Henry illegal in God's eyes. Catherine fights back hard. Her entire case rests on one claim. She never had sexual relations with Arthur. She was a virgin when she married Henry, and she has proof. This is where those sheets become crucial. Catherine's desperate. If Henry gets his annulment, she loses everything. Her title as queen, her daughter Mary's legitimacy, her place in English society. She'll be demoted from Queen of England to Arthur's widow, basically a nobody. Her entire defence hinges on convincing the court that she never consummated her first marriage. How do you prove something that didn't happen? Well, if you've kept physical evidence from the something that did happen, your wedding night defloration. Catherine produces those blood-stained sheets in court. 28 years old, carefully preserved, probably yellowed and brittle by now. Her argument's elegant in its simplicity. Look, here's proof I bled on my wedding night with Arthur. This blood proves I was a virgin when I married him. Since this was the only night we shared a bed before he died, this proves our marriage was consummated. Therefore, the papal dispensation that allowed me to marry Henry was valid. The marriage to Henry is legitimate. Picture that courtroom moment. Catherine, now in her 40s, presenting intimate physical evidence from her teenage years to a room full of men deciding her fate. The sheets that once proved her purity now prove her impurity. It's medieval logic twisted into knots. The same bloodstain that proved she was a proper virgin bride in 1501 now proves she was not a virgin when she married Henry in 1509. The evidence cuts both ways, which is exactly Catherine's point. But Henry's court isn't interested in Catherine's evidence. The annulment proceedings drag on for years. Henry's already made up his mind. He's marrying Anne Boleyn with or without papal approval. The blood-stained sheets become just another exhibit in a case where the verdict's already decided. Henry eventually breaks from Rome entirely, declares himself head of the English Church, and grants himself the annulment. The sheets that Catherine saved for 3 decades, basically worthless in the end. Catherine ends up exiled to remote castles, stripped of her title, forbidden from seeing her daughter Mary. She dies in 1536, still calling herself the true Queen of England. Those sheets, who knows what happened to them? Probably burned or thrown away once the annulment was final. But think about what they represent. A teenage girl so terrified of future accusations that she saved physical evidence of her most intimate moment for 28 years, just in case someone questioned her honesty about her own body. The bedding ceremony connection. Picture this nightmare scenario. Your wedding night isn't private, not even close. Instead, an entire crowd of guests escorts you and your new spouse to the bedroom. They're not leaving, they're staying to watch. Welcome to the medieval bedding ceremony, where virginity testing merged with witness consummation in the most invasive tradition imaginable. This wasn't just about verification anymore. It was performance, theatre. And for the bride, it was pure humiliation, disguised as celebration. Tonight we're exploring how these rituals turned intimacy into public spectacle. Here's what makes bedding ceremonies so twisted. They combined virginity verification with entertainment. Think about that. The same event that was supposed to prove a bride's purity also became the night's main event for wedding guests. Family members, friends, even local nobles would crowd into the bedchamber. Some ceremonies had curtains drawn around the bed, but everyone knew what was happening behind them. Others, no curtains at all. The bride's most private moment became the most public moment of her life. Verification and voyeurism wrapped into one horrifying tradition. Who exactly showed up to these bedroom invasions? Pretty much everyone. The bride's family wanted proof their daughter was pure. The groom's family needed evidence they weren't being cheated. Local nobles attended because marriage was politics, not just romance. Sometimes priests blessed the bed beforehand. Midwives stood ready to examine evidence afterward. Even servants got involved. Someone had to light the candles, arrange the linens, and later display the bloodstained sheets. Your most intimate moment became a community event. Privacy simply didn't exist for medieval brides. Then came the stocking throwing. This sounds innocent until you understand what it meant. Wedding guests would literally throw the bride's and groom's stockings at the couple during the bedding ceremony. Whoever caught them was supposedly next to marry. But here's the twisted part. This happened while the couple was undressing or already in bed. Imagine being a terrified teenage bride, already humiliated by the crowd, and having your undergarments turned into party favours. The stockings represented the stripping away of her maidenhood. What looks like harmless fun was actually ritualised humiliation. The bride's garter held special significance. It wasn't just another piece of clothing. It was proof. After consummation, the groom would remove his bride's garter and present it to the witnesses as evidence the marriage had been completed. Sometimes he'd throw it to the male guests, like a trophy. Think about what this represented. A piece of fabric that had touched her most private areas became a public symbol that she was no longer pure. The garter transformed from intimate apparel to legal evidence to party souvenir. Her body became a commodity with accessories to prove ownership. The humiliation was the point, not the byproduct. Medieval society needed to publicly break down a woman's sense of bodily autonomy. The bedding ceremony achieved this perfectly. By forcing her to undress in front of strangers, submit to examination, and perform intimacy as theatre, they were establishing new power dynamics. She was no longer her father's daughter. She was now her husband's property. The shame was intentional. It marked her transition from one man's possession to another's. What we see as cruelty, they saw as necessary social programming. Regional variations made these ceremonies even more bizarre. In some areas, guests would drink wine while watching and commenting on the proceedings. Other regions required the bride to serve refreshments to witnesses before being examined. Certain cultures had musicians playing during consummation. Some traditions involved guests staying all night, sleeping on the bedroom floor to guard against trickery. The French had elaborate undressing rituals where specific family members removed specific garments. Each culture found new ways to make private moments public, turning personal intimacy into community entertainment. The witnesses served multiple legal purposes. They could testify in court that consummation occurred if the marriage was later challenged. They verified no substitution took place. Yes, some brides tried having other women stand in for them in darkened rooms. The witnesses confirmed the bride bled appropriately, proving her virginity. They also ensured no trickery with fake blood or other deception occurred. These weren't just perverted voyeurs, though some certainly were. They were legal guarantors, human evidence collectors. The bedding ceremony turned your wedding guests into unwilling accomplices to your humiliation. This connected directly to property law. Remember, if a bride wasn't a virgin, the groom could legally demand his dowry back. The bedding ceremony provided multiple witnesses who could testify about her condition. The bloodstained sheets weren't just medieval superstition, they were legal evidence. Courts would actually hear testimony from bedding ceremony witnesses in annulment cases. The bride's body became a crime scene, essentially. Every person in that room was gathering evidence that could be used against her if the marriage failed. Intimacy became litigation waiting to happen. Imagine the psychological trauma. You're maybe 14 years old. You've never been intimate with anyone. Now you're surrounded by dozens of strangers, including grown men, waiting to watch you lose your virginity, and then examine the evidence. Some brides reportedly fainted. Others tried to run. Many just dissociated completely, letting it happen to them, rather than actively participating. This wasn't just physical violation, it was mental torture. The bedding ceremony broke women psychologically before their marriages even truly began. It established terror as the foundation of intimacy. These ceremonies gradually evolved as society changed. The Protestant Reformation pushed some practices underground. Renaissance ideas about privacy slowly crept in, but the basic concept that a bride's body belonged to the community until proven otherwise, that took centuries to disappear. Some elements survived in wedding traditions we still recognize. Throwing the bouquet, the garter toss, carrying the bride over the threshold. These innocent customs have dark roots in bedding ceremonies where privacy was the enemy and humiliation was the goal. The echoes of medieval bedroom invasions still haunt modern weddings. Princess Diana's exam, 1980. Lady Diana Spencer, 19 years old, sits in a medical office, not for a routine checkup, for something far more invasive. The future Princess of Wales is about to undergo the same type of examination that medieval brides faced centuries earlier, because even in the modern era, some royal traditions refused to die. What happened in that room would make Diana the last British royal to face this particular scrutiny, and shockingly, it would become front-page news. The man conducting the examination? Dr. George Pinker, surgeon gynecologist to the Queen herself. One of the most respected medical professionals in Britain, yet here he was, carrying out a practice that medieval midwives once performed with far cruder methods. The irony wasn't lost on anyone paying attention. Modern medicine, ancient prejudices, the royal family maintaining traditions that most of the world had abandoned. Diana wasn't just marrying Prince Charles, she was submitting to centuries-old expectations about royal bloodlines. Think about this timing for a second. 1980. MTV launched that year. Personal computers were hitting the market. Women were fighting for equal rights in boardrooms and courtrooms. Yet a teenage girl was still having her virginity medically verified because she was marrying into royalty. The medieval obsession with intact hymens and legitimate heirs had somehow survived into the age of space shuttles. It's almost impossible to believe, but the evidence suggests it happened. Dr. Pinker's examination reportedly confirmed what the palace needed to hear. Diana's hymen was intact. She was, in medical terms, a virgin, but here's where this story gets even more surreal. That private medical information didn't stay private, not even close. The verification of Diana's purity was about to become one of the most bizarre media stories of the early 1980s, and the person who made it public, her own family. Enter Diana's uncle, Lord Fermoy. In a move that would shock even medieval standards of privacy, he decided to share the results of his niece's examination with the press. The Daily Star got the exclusive. "Diana is a virgin," he declared to the newspaper. Just imagine that conversation. A grown man discussing his teenage niece's private parts with tabloid reporters, making her most intimate medical information into tomorrow's headline. The medieval practice of public verification had evolved into something even more invasive: mass media coverage. The Daily Star ran the story like it was breaking news, which, in a way, it was. Royal virginity had been privately verified for centuries, but never publicly announced in newspapers. Diana's uncle wasn't just following tradition, he was modernizing it, turning medieval shame into modern publicity. The message was clear to anyone reading that morning paper. The future princess had passed the test. She was pure enough for the throne. Why did this even matter in 1980? Same reason it mattered in 1380. Legitimacy, bloodlines, the certainty that future heirs to the throne were actually royal blood. Charles needed a wife who could produce undisputed successors. No questions about paternity, no whispers about previous lovers. Just like those medieval kings, the modern monarchy still cared desperately about who had access to the royal womb first. Some things never change, but Diana's examination marked the end of an era. She was reportedly the last British royal to undergo virginity testing. The practice that started with medieval midwives inspecting peasant brides had finally reached its conclusion in a posh London medical office. After Diana, the royal family quietly abandoned this particular tradition. Maybe they realised how medieval it looked to the modern world. Or maybe they just couldn't control the media coverage anymore. The parallel to medieval practices is striking. Remember those midwives examining brides before their wedding nights? Same concept, different setting. Instead of a village midwife, Diana got the Queen's personal doctor. Instead of worried fathers and husbands, she had the entire monarchy watching. Instead of blood-stained sheets displayed to guests, she got newspaper headlines. The method evolved. The invasion of privacy remained exactly the same. What's haunting is how normal this seemed at the time. Diana was 19, barely out of her teens, yet she submitted to this examination because that's what royal brides did. No one questioned whether it was appropriate for 1980. No one asked if a woman's worth should still be measured by a medical examination. The weight of tradition, the pressure of royalty, the assumption that her body belonged to the crown before it belonged to her. Diana's story shows us how recently these medieval attitudes finally died. 1980. Your parents might remember that year. Maybe you were alive then. Yet a teenage girl was still having her virginity verified for marriage into royalty. The same anxiety about female purity that drove medieval fathers to inspect bloody sheets was still driving royal policy 40 years ago. When you think about how far we've come and how recently we arrived, it's both remarkable and terrifying. The double standard. Here's what gets me about this whole virginity testing obsession. It only went one way. Medieval society built an entire industry around verifying women's sexual history. Midwives, fumigation tests, blood-stained sheets, public examinations. But men? Nothing. Zero. Not a single test, examination, or verification ritual. A groom could have slept with half the village and nobody cared. In fact, sexual experience in men was often seen as a good thing. Proof of virility, masculinity, desirability. The hypocrisy is staggering. Think about this for a second. A woman's worth was literally measured by what hadn't happened to her body. Her value decreased with experience, but for men, experience increased their value. A sexually active bachelor was worldly, experienced, desirable. A sexually active woman was damaged goods. This wasn't just cultural preference. This was law, written into legal codes, enforced by courts, defended by the church. The same act that elevated a man's status destroyed a woman's. Same behavior, opposite consequences. Why was male sexual experience considered advantageous? Medieval logic said experienced men made better husbands. They knew what they were doing. They could guide their innocent wives. They'd gotten their wild impulses out of their system. But women with experience? They were corrupted, untrustworthy, potentially diseased. They might compare their husbands unfavourably to previous lovers. They might crave variety. The same knowledge that made men valuable made women worthless. It's insane when you spell it out like that. The legal framework made this crystal clear. Laws existed to punish false virgins, to compensate deceived husbands, to verify women's purity. But nowhere, and I mean nowhere, can you find laws requiring men to prove their sexual history. No tests for male chastity. No penalties for sexually experienced grooms. No compensation for wives who discovered their husbands weren't virgins. The law itself codified the double standard. Women's bodies were public business. Men's bodies remained private property. This reveals something dark about medieval power structures. Women weren't people in their own right. They were vessels, containers for future heirs. Their value lay entirely in their ability to guarantee paternity. Men owned property, including their wives' bodies. They needed assurance their investment was sound, their bloodline secure. But men? They could father children anywhere without legal consequence. Bastards were acknowledged, legitimized, even inherited titles. The rules were different because the stakes were different. Here's a specific example that really drives this home. A noble lord could openly keep mistresses, visit brothels, father illegitimate children. Everyone knew. Nobody cared. But if his wife was discovered to have had even one sexual encounter before marriage, annulment, public disgrace, legal penalties, her entire family's reputation destroyed. The same lord who demanded virginity from his bride might have deflowered dozens of other men's brides. And that was just normal, expected even. The economic reasoning gets even uglier when you dig deeper. A woman's virginity was literally her price tag. Virgin brides commanded higher dowries, better marriage prospects, more prestigious husbands. Non-virgins were marked down like damaged merchandise. But men? Sexual experience made them more expensive, not less. Worldly bachelors were catches. They brought knowledge, connections, sometimes even illegitimate children who could serve the household. Same commodity, virginity versus experience, opposite market values based purely on gender. Imagine being a medieval woman living under this system. Your entire future hung on something you might lose accidentally. Horseback riding, heavy lifting, medical examinations, anything could damage the physical evidence of your worth. Meanwhile, your brothers were encouraged to sow wild oats, gain experience, learn about the world. You lived in terror of false accusations while they lived in freedom. The psychological weight of that double standard, constant vigilance about your reputation, while watching men face zero consequences for the same behaviours. There's literally no historical record of equivalent male testing anywhere in medieval Europe. No male virginity ceremonies, no examinations of grooms, no physical verification of their sexual history. When you think about it, this absence is deafening. If virginity was truly about purity, morality, or divine favour, why wouldn't it apply equally? The silence around male sexual behaviour reveals the truth. This was never about morality, it was about ownership, control, making sure the property came with clear title. What this says about medieval concepts of honour is fascinating. Male honour came from conquest, military, sexual, economic. Taking what you wanted showed strength, but female honour came from resistance, denying, avoiding, preserving. The same aggressive sexuality that proved a man's worth destroyed a woman's. Honour itself was gendered. Men gained it through action, women gained it through inaction. Two completely different moral frameworks operating in the same society, creating completely different rules for completely different people. The implications stretch far beyond the bedroom. This double standard shaped everything: inheritance law, property rights, political power, religious authority. If women's worth depended on sexual purity, while men's depended on sexual conquest, then women could never accumulate the experience, connections, or reputation needed for real power. The virginity obsession wasn't just about marriage. It was about keeping women dependent, controllable, confined. The system worked exactly as designed, and that's what makes it so terrifying to contemplate. Cross-cultural comparisons. Here's what gets me about this whole virginity obsession. It wasn't just medieval Europe being weird. This was happening everywhere. Different continents, different centuries, different religions. But the same basic idea: a woman's body as proof of purity. Armenia had the red apple ceremony. Georgia had white cloth rituals. Africa, Asia, the Mediterranean, they all had their versions. And here's the thing that really hits you when you see the pattern. This wasn't coincidence. This was universal anxiety about women's sexuality. Armenia's red apple ceremony is intense. Picture this: the morning after the wedding. The groom's mother and female relatives gather around the bed. They're looking for blood on the sheets, just like medieval Europe. But here's where it gets specific. They call the blood stain the red apple. If they find it, they celebrate. If they don't, the bride faces public shame. Her family's honour is destroyed. The groom can annul the marriage. Same stakes as medieval England, just different imagery. Same terror for young brides. Georgia takes the white cloth tradition even further. On the wedding night, the groom's mother gives the couple a pristine white cloth. After consummation, she inspects it for blood. But here's what's chilling: if there's no blood, the entire wedding becomes void. The guests go home, the gifts get returned. The bride returns to her family in disgrace. Think about the pressure on these young women. One piece of fabric determining their entire future. Their worth as human beings reduced to a red stain on white cloth. Mediterranean cultures developed their own variations. In parts of Greece, mothers would inspect their daughters before engagement, not after marriage. Turkey had similar pre-wedding examinations. Italy, well, Italian mothers were notorious for their scrutiny. What's wild is how each culture thought they invented this system, like they were the first to worry about female purity. But the methods were almost identical. The anxiety was identical. The control over women's bodies, absolutely identical. Just different languages expressing the same fear. African traditions varied wildly by region, but the underlying theme remained. Some cultures practiced formal examinations by elder women. Others relied on wedding night evidence like Europe. In parts of Morocco, bloodied sheets were displayed to the entire community. Ethiopia had ritual inspections before marriage contracts were signed. What strikes me is the ceremony around it all. These weren't secret, shameful moments. They were public celebrations of purity. The community participation made it feel normal, even sacred. But normal doesn't mean humane. Asian cultures brought their own sophistication to virginity testing. Ancient China had elaborate medical examinations. Japan developed specific rituals around the wedding night. Korea maintained strict pre-marriage inspections, well into the 20th century. But here's what's fascinating. These weren't crude medieval practices. These were highly refined, medically justified systems. Doctors were involved. Ceremonies were elegant. The oppression was beautiful, if you can imagine such a thing. Sophisticated cruelty is still cruelty, elegant control is still control, the silk glove hiding the iron fist. Even within Europe, every region had its twist on the basic theme. Spain developed elaborate Catholic rituals around purity verification. France had regional variations that differed by province. Eastern Europe maintained these practices longer than Western Europe. Russia had its own bloodstained traditions. What's remarkable is how isolation led to similar solutions. These cultures weren't copying each other. They were independently arriving at the same conclusion. Women's bodies needed verification. Male anxiety about paternity was apparently universal. Geography couldn't contain this particular fear. The really disturbing part, some of these practices never stopped. Rural communities in various countries maintained virginity testing into the 21st century. Turkey only officially banned virginity examinations in 2002. Some regions of Africa, Asia, and the Middle East still practice variations today. Modern medicine should have ended this. Women's rights movements should have killed it. But tradition runs deep. Cultural shame runs deeper. In 2023, young women somewhere in the world still face the same terror medieval brides knew. Think about the psychological damage across all these cultures. Generation after generation of women raised to believe their worth lived between their legs. Young girls learning that their future happiness depended on an intact membrane. The wedding night terror was universal, not just fear of pain, but fear of discovery, fear of family shame, fear of rejection. This wasn't just physical examination, this was systematic psychological control, creating anxiety about sexuality that would last lifetimes, making women police their own bodies. What connected all these cultures? The same basic anxieties: male uncertainty about paternity, property inheritance concerns, family honor tied to female sexuality, religious concepts of purity. But here's what's interesting. The methods varied, but the timing was consistent. Most cultures focused on the wedding night rather than pre-marriage examination. There was something about that specific moment, the transition from daughter to wife, that demanded proof, the ritual marking of ownership, the public verification of a private act, the performance of purity for an audience. So why was this obsession truly universal? Because it solved a fundamental problem that existed before DNA testing. How do you prove paternity? In a world where inheritance, property, and family names passed through bloodlines, uncertainty about fatherhood was existential terror for men. Virginity testing was never really about morality or religion, though those became convenient justifications. It was about property rights, about ensuring your wealth went to your actual children. Women's bodies became the battleground for men's economic anxiety. That's why it appeared everywhere, independently. Same problem, same solution. Science versus superstition. Here's the thing that gets me about all these virginity tests. They were based on complete anatomical nonsense. Medieval doctors thought they understood the female body, but they got it spectacularly wrong. The hymen, this tiny membrane that became the center of entire legal systems, doesn't work the way they believed. Not even close. We're talking about centuries of women's lives destroyed over a basic misunderstanding of human anatomy. Medieval physicians were convinced an intact hymen meant virginity. Simple as that. If it was there, she was pure. If it wasn't, well, you know what happened. But here's what they didn't understand. Hymens come in all shapes and sizes. Some women are born with barely any hymen tissue. Others have thick elastic membranes that can stretch without tearing. The medieval experts had no clue about this natural variation. Then there's the bleeding myth. Oh, this one's huge. Medieval people believed all virgins bled during their first sexual encounter. Had to happen. No blood meant she'd done it before. But medical research shows about half of first-time experiences involve no bleeding at all. 0. The hymen might stretch gradually, tear so slightly there's no blood, or, and this is key, it might have already been stretched by normal activities. What kind of normal activities? Horse riding, dancing, heavy lifting, even just growing up. The hymen isn't this fragile seal that only breaks during sex. It's living tissue that changes throughout a woman's life. Medieval physicians had zero understanding of this. They thought the hymen was like a biological chastity belt, natural proof of purity, completely wrong, but entire legal systems were built on this misconception. The fumigation tests make even less sense when you understand basic anatomy. Remember those? Women covered with cloth, burning coals underneath, doctors checking if they could smell it through their nose. The theory was that virgins had some kind of closed internal system. Non-virgins had opened pathways that let the smell through. This isn't just wrong, it's hilariously wrong. But medieval doctors prescribed this with complete confidence. Here's what really happened in medieval bedchambers. Many genuine virgins experienced no bleeding, while some non-virgins might bleed from other causes. Rough handling, anxiety-induced tension, even monthly cycles could affect the evidence. But the medieval mind couldn't process this complexity. They needed simple answers. Blood equals virgin. No blood equals deception. Reality doesn't work that way. Bodies don't work that way. Medieval science was pure guesswork, wrapped in authority. The urine tests were based on equally ridiculous logic. Doctors believed virgin bodies processed certain substances differently. Give a virgin dock flower essence, she'd turn pale immediately. Non-virgins wouldn't react. Or the drinking tests, specific concoctions that supposedly made non-virgins urinate instantly. There's no biological mechanism that could make any of this work. These weren't medical procedures. They were elaborate forms of magical thinking disguised as science. What's fascinating is that some medieval people suspected these tests were unreliable. That's why the Trotula included recipes for faking virginity. Why would you need elaborate deception techniques if the tests actually worked? Medieval women knew their own bodies better than the doctors examining them. They understood that hymens could be stretched or absent for reasons having nothing to do with sexual experience, but they couldn't say this publicly. The midwives doing these examinations, many of them probably knew the tests were meaningless. They'd examined enough women to see the natural variations, but they were trapped in a system that demanded certainty where none existed. Some likely lied to protect women they knew were innocent. Others went along with obvious deceptions. The science was wrong, but the social pressure to produce results was overwhelming. Modern medicine completely debunks every single medieval virginity test. Every one. The hymen, when present, can be stretched or torn by dozens of non-sexual activities. First-time bleeding occurs in fewer than half of all cases. There's no physical test that can determine sexual history with any reliability. Medieval physicians weren't stupid, they just didn't have the knowledge. But their confident ignorance destroyed countless women's lives. The tragic irony, all those fumigation chambers, urine tests and sheet inspections, were based on fundamental misunderstandings of female anatomy. Centuries of women humiliated, marriages destroyed, and lives ruined over medical theories that were completely wrong. The hymen they obsessed over wasn't the reliable indicator they believed. It never was. Medieval science failed women spectacularly, but the legal system never caught up with the medical reality. Closing reflection. So here we are, at the end of this journey through medieval bedchambers. What strikes me most isn't the cruelty, it's how systematic it all was. These weren't random acts of misogyny. They were carefully constructed legal frameworks, laws written by men for men about women's bodies. Every fumigation test, every bloodstained sheet, every midwife examination, it served the same purpose, protecting male property rights. That's what gets me about this whole story, because when you strip away all the religious justification and moral posturing, medieval virginity testing was never really about purity. It was about inheritance, about making sure the first child belonged to the husband, about ensuring property flowed to the right bloodline. Women's bodies became the battleground where family fortunes were won or lost. The hymen wasn't sacred, it was a legal document written in flesh. That's the brutal truth of it all. And the lengths women went to preserve their honour. The leeches, the chicken blood, the elaborate chemical recipes from the Trotula. These weren't just desperate measures. They were survival tactics in a world that offered no forgiveness for female sexuality. Think about that level of terror, knowing your entire future depended on a physical membrane that might not even bleed when broken. The psychological torture alone is staggering to consider. What's really wild is how these practices crossed every social boundary. Poor peasant girls faced the same scrutiny as princesses. If anything, noble women had it worse. More witnesses, higher stakes, entire kingdoms watching. Catherine of Aragon keeping those blood-stained sheets for decades? That wasn't sentimentality. That was legal insurance in a world where your virginity could topple governments. Power made the testing more public, not less invasive. And the pseudoscience behind it all. Fumigation tests where virgins supposedly couldn't smell burning coal. Urine tests that revealed sexual history. Medieval doctors actually believed this stuff worked. They built entire medical practices around anatomical ignorance. The confidence they had in methods that were completely useless shows how desperately society needed these tests to work. Reality didn't matter. The system required certainty, even fake certainty. Picture being a medieval bride on your wedding night. Not thinking about love or intimacy, but about performance, about producing the right evidence for an audience of strangers. Your most private moment became public theatre. The bedroom door didn't just close on husband and wife, it opened to family members, witnesses, entire communities. Privacy was a luxury women couldn't afford. Their bodies belonged to everyone but themselves. The fact that echoes of this survived until Princess Diana's engagement in 1981 should shock us more than it does. A royal physician examining her hymen, her uncle publicly declaring her purity to newspapers. This wasn't ancient history. This was 40 years ago. Within living memory, a woman's worth was still measured by an intact membrane. That's how deeply these beliefs embedded themselves in Western culture. Meanwhile, men faced zero equivalent scrutiny, ever. Male sexual experience was irrelevant, sometimes even celebrated. No groom ever had his body examined by strangers. No man's worth was tied to his sexual history. The double standard wasn't accidental, it was the entire point. Women's sexuality was dangerous property that needed constant monitoring. Male sexuality was just sexuality. The asymmetry was built into the foundation of medieval marriage. What this whole system reveals about medieval society is darker than individual cruelty. It shows how completely women were written out of their own lives. They couldn't own property, couldn't inherit equally, couldn't choose their husbands, and they couldn't even own their own bodies. Virginity testing was just the enforcement mechanism for a much larger cage. The tests weren't the problem. They were the symptom of seeing women as objects. Today we view these public displays of privacy with disbelief. We're horrified by the fumigation tests, the bedding ceremonies, the displayed sheets. But here's what gives me hope. We're horrified. These practices seem barbaric to us now because we've actually made progress. Women are no longer assessed based on a physical membrane, but on their intellect, their character, their humanity. That shift didn't happen by accident. As you settle into the privacy of your own bed tonight, remember what we've learned. For centuries, a woman's most intimate moment was public performance. Her worth measured by strangers examining her body. The echo of these practices is faint now, but it serves as a stark reminder of how far we've come. Rest well in your privacy, grateful that the bedroom door finally closes behind only those who belong there.